Page 82. White. I saw the black sedan parked outside of my house. Right away I knew that something was wrong. There were two open spots on either side, but the car was parked in front of the hydrant anyway. I could hear my dad's voice from inside. It was loud and polite, like he was talking to company. I turned the knob and everything got quiet. Two detectives were sitting on the couch, facing me. One of them stood up and stretched out his long legs. The other one stayed where he was and said, "This must be your son, Eddie." My mom came over and put her hands around my shoulders. She steered me through the living room like I was blind and she had just changed all the furniture around. The one who was standing took a giant step towards me and stuck out his hands. "I'm Detective Smoltz," he said, as my fingers disappeared inside his grip. He squeezed with my hands and looked straight into my eyes. It felt like he could pull anything he wanted right out of me. From across the room, my dad was staring me in the face. I thought he was about to scream at me. Then his eyes bounced between the two detectives and he got himself together. Gotti was anchored at the feet of the one sitting down. The detectives got up only halfway and leaned forward. He stayed low enough to keep petting Gotti with one hand while he shook mine with the other. "Eddie, my name is Detective O'Grady," he said. "My partner and I wanted to talk to you about a string of robberies and shootings." O'Grady asked a lot of questions about Marcus. My mom and dad answered a couple of them before I could even open my mouth. He knew all about black and white and my scholarship to St. John's. He asked what me and Marcus liked to do after practice. That's when my dad got really upset and wanted to know what if they were investigating me. "We're just trying to understand what happened that night," O'Grady said. "We know that Eddie spends a lot of time with Marcus. Maybe he can be helpful." Rose came home right behind me, and my mom tried to take her upstairs. But she wanted to tell the detectives how nice Marcus treated everybody. She said that if Marcus had done something bad, that it was probably because somebody talked him into it, that he was still part of our family no matter what. Then Smoltz asked, "Do you folks keep a .38 caliber revolver in this house?" My mom and Rose let out a gasp, but then got into a barking fit. "We don't own a gun," my dad said in a charged-up voice. Then he made a speech about how we were a tax-paying family and that there were real criminals running around the streets. Though through that whole scene, Smoltz and O'Grady never took their eyes off of me. I didn't know where to put my hands or how to hold my arms. The detectives on TV were experts at reading body language, so I figured that they probably were too. I went over and stood between my mom and Rose, and they both wrapped their arms around me. Now they'd have to judge me between two people who had nothing to hide. Before they left, O'Grady gave me his card and said, "Call me if you remember something that can make it easier on Marcus. No one wants to see him get what he doesn't deserve." The door closed behind him, and I didn't know what to do next. My dad started ripping into Marcus. Rose and my mom were yelling at him to stop. "It's where he was brought up," he said. "It's either rob or be robbed, but everybody here goes around saying he's part of this family. Now the police are at our door." Rose wanted to call Marcus to tell him about the detectives, but my parents wouldn't let her, and told me not to call either. They said we should keep some distance until the investigation was finished. My mom was so upset that she couldn't make dinner, and things didn't settle down until she sent my dad out for Chinese food. I sat down on the couch in the spot where O'Grady had been sitting. It was still warm. I wasn't about to give the cops anything to work with, but no matter how I explained it to myself, I couldn't get away from how I was turning my back on Marcus. It wasn't black and white anymore. It was just me looking out for my own ass. I held O'Grady's card in front of my face. I looked at all the numbers and the police department seal up in the corner. I felt everything I ever worked for slipping away. My scholarship, the pros, everything. I knew that the cops figured it out it was me with Marcus that night. They probably just didn't have enough evidence to prove it, or they would have arrested me. I folded the card in half and buried it in my pocket. That night I couldn't sleep. I heard the floor in the attic creak. I got out of bed. I knew I had to face what was up there. I could see a light from under the door as I got closer. When I got to the top of the steps, I pushed the door open. My dad was staring right at me. He was sitting on my grandpa's bed with the shoebox in his hands. The rubber bands were still wrapped around it. I stood in the door waiting for him to say anything. But he weighed the box in his palm and shook it to hear the sound it made. "I don't ever want to open this box, Eddie, do I?" he asked. I looked him in the eye as long as I could. He never raised his voice. He just told me to get my ass back in bed. And I did. I don't know what he did with the box after that, but in the morning it was gone. He didn't tell my mom a thing about it either. He acted like it never happened. Only I could see it behind his eyes, no matter how hard he tried to hide it. It was a look that said, "How could I raise you to do something like that?" And when my mom mentioned Marcus that morning, I saw the explosion inside him. I spent that whole Saturday trying to stay out of his sight. I didn't want to go to the circle and run into Marcus either, so I shot fouls for almost 2 hours on the court over by the DS. And all the time I was there, maybe 20 sanitation trucks rolled in and out of the big garage. The crews on more than half of them stopped to congratulate me on getting the scholarship. Dad had bragged to everyone he worked with. Now he was at home, pretending he was still proud of me. On Sunday morning at 11 o'clock, O'Grady and Smoltz showed up. They shook my dad's hand at the front door and wiped their feet on the welcome mat. Then they arrested me in my living room. My mom and Rose were at church. I was glad they weren't around to see it. Gotti growled at the detectives and showed them his teeth, so my dad had to drag him out of the backyard. O'Grady said that the woman who had been robbed picked my picture out of the school yearbook. Smoltz went upstairs to search my room, but he came back shaking his head. They took me out in front of the porch in handcuffs. Some of the neighbors were even outside. My dad was walking right behind us. I wouldn't turn around to look at him. "Don't say anything until I get you a lawyer," I heard him say from over my shoulder. O'Grady pushed my head down as he put me into the back seat of the car. I could hear Gotti barking from around back until O'Grady slammed the door shut. Then they took me away with my dad watching from the curb. At the station house, they asked me questions for almost 2 hours, but I wouldn't say a word. Keeping my mouth shut and waiting for a lawyer was tough, but listening to how they had it all pieced together was even harder. Smoltz liked telling it again and again and watching me sweat. They knew about everything, except for my grandpa's gun. "Sooner or later, Marcus is going to fill in all the cracks for us. His lawyer will wise him up, you'll see," said O'Grady. "That will leave you holding the gun, Eddie. That's just the way it works. Time is time. There is no more black and white. Those days are over. Nobody's going to watch your back any more but you." Smoltz explained how I could come clean and maybe the DA would agree to go easier on me. Then he explained how Marcus could get the same deal for himself and stick it to me. "My partner and I have been together for 9 years, O'Grady said. What would you do if I shot somebody and asked you to keep it quiet, Detective Smoltz?" "I'd turn you over in a heartbeat," answered Smoltz. I spent the nights in central booking, and everything they said started echoing in my ears. I didn't get a wink of sleep. All the thugs and drunks in the cell were acting up. But I would have fought every one of them and kicked their asses too if it could erase everything I did. Next morning I got transferred to the courthouse by bus. In the pens I had my game face on. I had lots of talk about me being a white boy. The system wasn't hard to figure out. You went into the courtroom, and unless someone knew your face from America's Most Wanted, the judge gave you bail. But lots of guys couldn't pay it. They came back to the pens bitching, and the guards put them on the bus for Rikers Island. I got called out to a side room to meet my lawyer, Mr. Golub. My dad found him through his boss, whose son had fucked up once too. He explained to me what would happen out in the courtroom and what I would say. Then he would meet with me and my dad in a few days after he studied the case more. When I got back to the pens, I caught an earful. "Tell me a white boy came from seeing the judge and is going to the island," one guy said. "Get real now. Money came back from talking with his mouthpiece, that's all," said another black dude. They stood up in front against the bars. That's where the officers had their desk. "Big boy, you feel safer up here?" one of the officers grinned. Thought about how it was different when me and Marcus had each other's back. I knew that I was going home in a couple of hours. Then I'd only have to worry about my mom and what the coach at St. John's would say. There were 2 other white guys who got called out ahead of me. Neither one of them came back. That didn't bother me. An officer walked me in the courtroom and we came out from behind the flag. Mom and Rose were sitting in the front row sharing rosary beads. Their eyes were red and swollen from crying. My dad looked me up and down like he hardly knew me. The DA read the evidence against me out loud and my mom let out a sob. My lawyer said something in legal talk, then the judge asked me if I understood everything. "Yes, sir," I answered. I couldn't believe this was happening, but it was. There was some more talk between the lawyers and the judge. When it was over, I had bail.